Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar on the subject of R2V3, lessons learned and common NCRs. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Program Manager with PJR. Welcome. I have a brief agenda on this first slide here. We're going to go through a little bit of housekeeping information, talk briefly about Perry Johnson registrars, who we are, what we do. We'll cover at a high level the benefits of certification to a standard like R2V3, but this webinar, is focused on currently certified clients who are preparing either to have their R2V3 transition audit or just looking to feel more prepared for their upcoming R2V3 surveillance audit. We're going to cover common NCRs as well as some lessons learned now that we've been auditing to the R2V3 standard for about 1.5 years now. We will close with an overview of the certification process just for anyone who may be tuning in and is new, pursuing initial certification rather than transitioning at this time. And we'll close with any questions. So feel free to type your questions into the chat field at any point during the presentation. We are recording today's webinar. A recording of the presentation as well as copies of the slides will be made available on PJR's website after the webinar. Questions can be typed at any time, as I mentioned, but we will be addressing those at the end of the presentation. And this webinar is based on professional experience. However, CIRI and their R2V3 knowledge base website offer formal training, documented standard interpretations, various articles, podcasts, training materials, a whole wealth of information where you can dig into some of the requirements further and see if answers to your questions can be found directly from CIRI on that site. I highly recommend you check that out if you haven't already. If you're struggling, so we'll talk very briefly about PJR. We are one of the leading registrars in the world. We have certified companies to a wide variety of standards around the globe. This list is certainly not all-inclusive, but gives you an idea of our global presence as a certification body. And PJR is accredited to grant certification to a number of standards. As I mentioned, today's presentation is focused on R2V3, one of many standards to which we hold a current accreditation. Benefits of certification vary by industry and location, but generally the benefits for certification to a standard like R2 include that commitment to responsibly reusing and recycling electronics, driving improvements within their EHS system, their environmental health and safety system, facilitating the meeting of customer and/or regulatory requirements, should any be applicable, improvements to management commitment and employee engagement levels, the ability to advertise this standard certification. It can yield a competitive advantage or improve public image or both. Sometimes there are other financial benefits beyond the competitive advantage. Sometimes there are insurance premium discounts, for example. Working to achieve strategic objectives that a corporation may have or stakeholders may have, and the ability to integrate certification with other business management systems. Diving right into the meat of today's webinar, we're going to focus on some of the most common NCRs in order for you to prepare for your R2V3 audits with that information in mind. These are not in any particular order. And the contents of this webinar is based on tracking of all R2V3 NCRs that we're required to do for SERI. It allows us to analyze that data and put together the contents of this webinar to give you an idea of where our auditors and package reviewers are seeing the majority of the issues. So getting right into it, one of the most common sources of NCRs is deficiencies in Appendix A. If you are already familiar with R2V3, you know that Appendix A houses the downstream due diligence requirements. So I've grouped a number of things together. There are so many different NCRs that could be written against Appendix A since it contains a number of requirements within it. Some examples of Appendix A NCRs that we see commonly are incomplete records of due diligence or downstream management, incorrectly identifying non-R2 downstream vendors as R2 downstream vendors, since the R2V3 standard only recognizes R2V3 certification as R2 certification. This has an impact not only on the requirements for due diligence, but also audit time for Appendix A. Deficiencies in verification of the downstream vendor's ability to meet the Appendix A requirements or the relevant other appendices. So if you are, for example, utilizing a downstream vendor to conduct physical data sanitization on your behalf, not only do they need to meet the Appendix A requirements, they also need to meet Appendix B requirements for you to be utilizing them for data destruction rather than doing that in-house. Those requirements don't go away. So if sanitization is happening and you're not doing it in-house, you're using another company, how can you demonstrate to the auditor that you have verified they meet the Appendix B applicable requirements? Another common NCR found in Appendix A or cited against Appendix A is the requirement to hold pollution liability insurance. If your organization processes negative value equipment, a new term introduced in R2V3 that you can find defined in the standard and on the SERI knowledge base website, pollution liability insurance is required. Unlike in R2 2013, where you could have potentially a waiver or a letter saying that you didn't need it, that is no longer the case for R2V3. This is also commonly misinterpreted or confused with the exemptions for holding a financial instrument, two completely different things, unfortunately. Common NCRs are also written against Appendix B for, again, a whole host of reasons. Some of those could include having insufficient processes for logical and or physical sanitization that meet Appendix B, or insufficient security controls to meet the requirements of Appendix B. You could also have deficiencies in the documented process. Does the data sanitization plan include everything that Appendix B requires? So definitely compare your plan and your processes to the requirements in Appendix B to avoid some findings there. Some examples include not using software for logical sanitization, even though that is expressly required in Appendix B, maintaining recordings of video physical destruction, identifying the destruction types, using unique identifiers. I mentioned gaps in the data sanitization plan, insufficient training or competency controls. Those are just a couple examples. Again, Appendix B contains a lot of requirements within it, so do review that carefully. It's a common source of NCRs. We also commonly see NCRs written against Appendix C. These could again be insufficient processes or incomplete documentation of the process requirements. So Appendix C will specify what the reuse plan needs to include. Do ensure your reuse plan includes all of those criteria, touches on all of those points, specifically addressing how each will be fulfilled. Similarly, make sure the processes utilized meet the requirements of Appendix C. For example, are you maintaining individualized records for each item tested? For each functionality of each item tested, are there records? You need to account for all media types, all electronic types that you will reasonably process to ensure that you have testing and sanitization protocols for each. And these should be clearly identified in your scope as well. You shouldn't be certified for products or processes that you don't do. And you also shouldn't be certified for processes and products that you want to do in the future but aren't currently doing now. Again, make sure your reuse plan checks all the boxes and meets all of the requirements of Appendix C. Another comment is core requirement 1. Ensure that all relevant names for the organization are included within the scope and within the certification. What I mean by that is all relevant registered entity names under which you're doing business, under which you are conducting those R2 certifiable activities. We shouldn't see a number of DBAs being utilized, some other names on sales records or invoices or BOLs if they are not on the certificate. So you'll either need to include them in the certification if that's feasible and appropriate, if they're registered entity names. Otherwise, you'll need to remove them and stop using them. The scope of certification is really clear that it needs to cover all of those activities, all of those relevant names, and it needs to be accurate. The specific certificate for R2 is facility-based, but we also have to ensure it's accurately representing your business. We don't want it to be misleading in any way. So using other names or not including names that you use is really misleading. And that goes for your website. Like I said, the different types of record keeping you might have, sales methodologies, if they are registered entity names that you use in conjunction with your R2 certifiable activities, they do need to be included. Another important component of core requirement 1 is scheme. So the difference between single facilities and campuses is significant, and ensuring that you have correctly identified and certified under the appropriate scheme. Those are identified in the R2V3 Code of Practices. Scope verbiage is also very important for R2V3. Again, further elaborated in the Code of Practices are the scope requirements. Very specific word tracks based on the appendices for which your organization qualifies. And again, being really specific as to the types of electronics processed so that the scope is as accurate as possible. Core requirement 3 has common NCRs related to a number of items, most commonly the risk assessment requirements in Core 3, those exposure evaluation expectations, and or the monitoring evidence that goes hand in hand with the outputs of those risk assessment and exposure evaluations. That would be the most common source of NCRs for core requirement 3. A common source of NCR for core requirement 5 would be the summaries of transactions. To be unable to fulfill the summary of transaction requirements to show everything inbound and outbound and account for all of the material is a significant issue with R2V3. So whether you don't have it at all or you have some but not all of the transactions, that's a common NCR for R2V3 and a significant gap. Core requirement 6, common NCRs. Again, we see requirements or trends for not meeting the requirements of the core in both action and word. So whether the documented processes meet the requirements of the standard, and then as well, are they effectively implemented? Are you doing what you say you'll do? Do the actions meet the requirements of the standard? Core requirement 6 contains a lot of the core requirements for the standard, how the material is sorted, how it is assessed for further processing needs to ensure that the flow of material upholds the intent of the standard. So being able to identify as materials come in and control is maintained, whether they contain data that requires sanitization, whether they have reuse potential, and ensuring that depending on the type of material and what type of processing it needs to adhere to the standard, that it is sorted or secured or sent for processing accordingly. If it's going to go through Appendix B and or C, if you're doing that in-house, that you're meeting those requirements. If you are sending it to a downstream vendor to fulfill any of those appendices, that you have qualified them accordingly and effectively routed that material in a secure manner to ensure that it's processed according to those appendices on your behalf. Examples here might be using appropriate categories that meet core requirement 6 requirements, as well as incorporating and adhering to the REC. The REC is not auditable, but there are a number of references to the REC in the core, which means we can still write NCRs for not incorporating the REC under the core requirements. Ensuring test records are adequate, that the sorting process is robust, that if material is already tested or sanitized, you have the individualized records or a sampling process and your own appendices to confirm those grades and categories are appropriate and conduct that sampling where appropriate. Like I said, core requirement 6 really houses a good chunk of the intent of the standard here to ensure that material is controlled, that it's processed according to the intent of the standard, and basically, like I said, assessing what each needs and ensuring that the processes follow suit to meet the standard requirements, whether you guys are going to do them in-house or send them to a downstream vendor to fulfill those requirements. A common source of NCR for core requirement 7 could be insufficient processes to meet the core, as well as incomplete documentation of the process requirements. So here again, we see references to the data sanitization plan in the core. In core 7, does the plan meet the requirements of core 7? Do the processes, whether you are doing physical under the core instead of Appendix B, or that the material will go through Appendix B, whatever the case may be, the requirements of core 7 are a common source of NCR. These could be gaps within the plan. These could be training gaps. They could be gaps in the process for identifying and securing pre-sanitized media, so data-bearing media not yet sanitized. Common NCRs also include maintaining appropriate acknowledgements and security controls according to Core 7, maintaining the independent audit requirements in Core 7. Those are just a couple examples. A common source of NCR for Core Requirement 9, deficiencies in the closure plan, insufficient evidence of a financial instrument. Again, remember that the financial instrument is separate from the pollution liability insurance requirement in Appendix A to have, if you are having negative value equipment. The financial instrument is found in Core 9. There are a couple of exemptions for the financial instrument. There are 3 specifically, but you need to maintain all 3. You need to meet the requirements for all 3 in order to not be required to have a financial instrument. And those are facilities of a certain size, closure costs below a certain dollar amount, and the not processing specific types of focus materials that pose a greater amount of risk. And it's not just not processing them, but actually prohibiting them, not allowing them to ever come into the facility. Core Requirement 9 also covers insurance coverage, which for some companies or organizations in conjunction with Appendix A will include pollution insurance. I would say the majority of companies will have negative value equipment, but it depends on your scope. So those are some of the main sources of NCRs. Are there others? Sure, but those are the most common. In terms of lessons learned beyond those most common sources of NCRs, we can also share some things that we, as a registrar, hope you focus on or are aware of and want to draw your attention to. Appendix applicability. We went through some of the appendices that are common sources of NCR. I would say Appendix A through C specifically are the most common. That's why I touched on them in the slides. It's important to ensure that you have qualified for the relevant appendices, no more, no less. You don't want to be missing appendices that you need because you'll be short audit time and your scope will not reflect everything that you actually do, but you're not allowed to have certified appendices that you don't actively fulfill. If it's something you want to do in the future, we can add it once you have implemented that process and you're ready to actually begin those activities. It's not something that we can look at what your procedure says that you'll do someday when you start getting those materials. And I mentioned that scoping is very closely tied to the appendices, so getting the appendices right is important. Some clients are still not aware that certain appendices for R2V3 require a certified quality management system where they did not require that before with R2 2013. That has come as a shock to some of our clients when we point out the appendices for which they want to be certified require a certified QMS. Logistically, it can be a little bit challenging to add the QMS if you're not already prepared for that in advance. So if you are transitioning soon, if you haven't gotten the ball rolling with assessing whether you need a certified QMS, I do recommend you do that and allow for the scheduling of the stage 1 and stage 2 audit that would be required to add a certified QMS if you don't already maintain one. There are a number of standards that fulfill the QMS requirement, and those can be found on CERI's website. I'm going to skip the scope verbiage one. I did already cover that. Suffice it to say that the scope is very specific. It's dictated almost exclusively by the Code of Practices. So unlike R2 2013, where you got to express creative freedom to an extent and identify what you wanted your scope to be, the scope for R2V3 is highly prescriptive. There are a number of changes to the NCR deadlines, the closure response deadlines, and expectations for resolving R2V3 NCRs. These are spelled out in the Code of Practices. At a high level, all R2V3 NCRs require revisits, and the deadlines for submitting the required components, 60 and 90 days respectively, are spelled out in the Code of Practices. At the time of your audit, they'll go through these in depth with you or in detail so that you can plan accordingly. I mentioned earlier how important facility schemes are, not only to ensure the audit time is appropriate, but also that the audit approach is going to meet the R2V3 requirements so that ultimately a certificate can successfully be issued. Virtual audits for R2V3 are possible. The Code of Practice has a number of limitations placed on R2V3 audits, what can and can't go virtual. And CERI has published a number of advisories that also affect the virtual eligibility of R2V3 audits. R2V3 transition audits are eligible for at least partial virtual audits if the client organization is able to support a virtual audit successfully. However, stage 2 audits are required to be on site for R2V3. R2V3 recertification audits are required to be on site. Certain types of special focus audits, like adding a site to a campus, will need to be on site. And at least one surveillance audit per cycle needs to be entirely on site as well. Again, those come from the Code of Practices. So those are not PGR specific limitations. For anyone pursuing initial certification, the steps are outlined at a high level on this certification step slide. It's important to obtain the standard, establish the required documentation, conduct any training, and implement the requirements. You'll need to have conducted an internal audit, your compliance evaluation, and a management review prior to successfully passing a stage 1 and stage 2 audit. You'll also need a contract with a certification body such as PJR, and you'll be asked to submit some pre-qualification information that I will talk about on the next slide to fulfill the contract validation activity. Once that's finished, you'll complete a stage 1 and stage 2 audit, address any resulting nonconformities, and ultimately be issued a R2V3 certificate. So circling back to the contract validation, this is an offsite activity required by the Code of Practices. They call it the contract review. And in instances of stage 1 clients, they also call it the stage 1 readiness. Stage 1 audits are primarily focused on documentation, although not exclusively. They confirm an organization's readiness to proceed to stage 2. Any NCRs identified for R2V3 at stage 1 need to be resolved with correction evidence prior to the stage 2 being approved. Then the stage 2 is a full system audit, covers the entirety of the management system. Any NCRs identified during the stage 2 need to be resolved within a certain period of time. Again, we're going to have revisits for all these R2V3 NCRs. And as a reminder, stage 2s for R2V3 must be on site according to the Code of Practices. Once you receive your certification, you're put on a 3-year cycle. The certificate's good for 3 years, so the following 2 years are surveillance audits, and then the 3rd year in the cycle is the recertification audit, starting the cycle all over. Recertification audits are very similar to the stage 2 in that they're a full system audit and result in a 3-year certificate when concluded. If you have any questions, feel free to type them now. I did go through that information quickly since the NCRs could cover a wide variety of requirements and the presentation is being recorded, but I do want to go to the next slide while you are typing or thinking of any questions that you might have and share relevant contact information. So again, my name is Austin. I'm the EHS Program Manager with PJR. I can be contacted by phone. That's the main PGR line. They can put you through to my extension, and my email address is on the screen as well. I do prefer email so that I can get back to you in a timely manner despite my scheduling conflicts. So my phone and email are listed there. And I've also included the sales department number. If you are a new client looking for a quote to get the process going for pursuing certification, that would be a good place to start. Let me see if we have any questions that I can answer today. Okay, no questions yet, but I will hang out here for another moment. Again, the presentation is being recorded and a copy of the slides will be available on PGR's website in the next couple of days so that you can tune back in, review this information to prepare for any upcoming audits. If you have your transition audit coming up, I do hope the information is helpful. Best of luck during your upcoming transition. I think the information is helpful even if you have already transitioned and you're getting ready for your surveillance for R2V3. And we will keep the content of these slides in this webinar updated if the trends in NCRs change with time so that we can present some new or up-to-date information. So feel free to tune back in to a future scheduling of this webinar as well to see if the content or the trends have changed. I don't see any questions, so I'm going to sign off here. Thank you so much for attending. I do hope the content's helpful. Feel free to tune back in for a future episode of this webinar or some of the other webinars that PJR offers. Have a great day.